Hi everyone, David Easterbrook here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be repotting a San Jose juniper. It's been a bonsai for many years. It's out of its pot now, and as you can see, it's very root bound. The whole pot is full of roots, so it does need to be repotted. What are the three ways you can tell if a tree needs to be repotted? Well, the first is once the pot is too full of roots, sometimes the root level rises in the pot until it's higher than the pot. Sure indication that it needs to be repotted. The second is by tapping on the top of the soil. And if it's hard, if it's like cement a bit, then that means the soil is too compacted also. The third way is, if you're not sure, is just taking it out of the pot and looking at the roots to see whether the bottom is full of roots. And if it isn't, you can just slide it back into the pot and re-anchor it into its pot. So those are the ways you can tell. So this one really does need a repotting. Today we're going to repot it and put it into a new pot. The last pot was a bit deep. Okay, now this pot, we want it in a slightly shallower pot. You can see the depth of the previous pot, but as a general rule, the pot should be about 2/3 the height of the tree, and the depth of the pot should be about the same diameter as the trunk at the base. So you don't want the pot overwhelming the tree. The pot has to sort of disappear under the tree. So we'll be putting it into a shallower pot. First of all, we're going to open up the top, get rid of all this old moss on the roots, get rid of, it's hard because there's organic fertilizer that is crusted on the soil surface. We have to remove that. And then we'll proceed to the next stage, which is removing roots from the bottom of the root ball. We're starting here. Why do bonsai need to be repotted? Or for that matter, any house plant? Because the roots need oxygen to live. Okay, the oxygen has to circulate among the feeder roots. If it doesn't, the roots will just wither. They'll dry out. Also, when you water, the water has to percolate between all the soil granules and go right to the bottom. If you don't repot often enough, the pot will fill itself with roots. The roots break down the soil particles and it becomes very dusty. It becomes very fine. And that stops the water from draining. The fine soil, which is what we're removing now, blocks all the pores so that the water doesn't drain out and the soil doesn't breathe. So that's why we're changing the soil. Now, we don't change it all. We'll be removing some of it, but a tree this age has been in bonsai soil for many, many years. Actually, what we're doing is just renewing part of the root ball. The old soil around the trunk should be fine, okay? But we do have to remove all the soil around the edges because the roots have spiraled around, and of course at the bottom too, because that's where most of the roots will be situated. Now, as I'm cleaning the top here, this long, thick root that's coming out from the trunk bothers me. I've been checking it. It doesn't seem to have that many feeder roots around it. So we're going to be removing this root. If it was a really nice root, I would create a bit of gin, a dead root at the base, but I don't think it needs it. So we'll remove it from the base of the tree. You see, it wasn't that strong a root. The trunk has better flow. It rises from the ground without that big root that's visually, it was an impediment. It stopped the eye. We've got part of an old chopstick in here, or an old root that I want to remove. There we go. There we go. You always have to clean up around the nabari. Make sure that if there's any moss growing on the main roots or the base of the tree, clean that off. Reveal the main roots. That's a real beauty point on your tree. You have to see those main roots and the rise of the tree from the roots up the trunk. So now the top has been cleaned. Now we want to get to the bottom here. You can see here, it's got very coarse soil. The bottom was draining. It was the top that was too tight. I'm going to hold it this way so that you can see me cleaning off the bottom. People often ask me, why do you always follow those 3 steps? The top, then the bottom, then the sides. Because when trees are growing in pots, the roots grow outwards, and when they hit the edge of the pot, they start spiraling around. And finally, they end up in the bottom where they gather because there's more air, more humidity there. But if you try to release the sides right away, the roots in the bottom are holding them. They're like this. They're holding the root ball together. So if you don't release the bottom roots, then you can't open up the sides properly. Junipers have very fine roots, but any tree, the feeder roots can dry in a very short time. So you should have a water bottle next to you and spray just lightly to keep those feeder roots nice and humid. Now, some people have been asking me, when do you repot junipers? Well, junipers can be repotted quite late in the season, contrary to pines, for example, or larches. Junipers have a continuous growth habit. So they grow right into the beginning of summer. They're sending out new roots and new foliage. So generally, I repot junipers right up until the beginning of June. They're probably the last conifers. Junipers and camas and thoyas are the last conifers that I repot during the spring. Sometimes you'll see me repotting them as late as the beginning of June. Now that's here in Montreal. I have friends down in North Carolina that have already finished all the repotting for the year. There is some old soil left around the base of the trunk, and that is rotting some roots. I've got some dead roots in here, so I'm removing some pie-shaped wedges so that I can get air, new potting soil that's very loose, closer to the trunk, so that the roots will be able to breathe, or the tree will be able to send out new roots, because this old soil is so compact that most of the roots near the trunk are dead. They've rotted. Now, you don't want to remove all the soil from your root ball, so I'm just removing a few pie-shaped wedges near the trunk to try to open up some breathing spaces around my trunk. I think I've removed most of the dusty old soil that's very compacted. It's very fine. It's originally was fibrous, but now it's just the finest of dust. So you want to get rid of that. Now, if it's a nursery tree, sometimes you can't do it in one fell swoop. If you try to do it just one time, you can kill the tree. So I usually do it over several years, removing the old soil until there's none left. I'll do it over several repottings. I've chosen a pot. It's much shallower and a bit larger. It's going to balance the tree quite well, and I'm going to plant it opposite, a little bit sideways to what it was. Originally it was this direction. Now I'm going to plant it in this direction. Before I plant it, I'm going to be pruning some roots, but I'm preparing the pot right now to hold the tree in place. A good quality pot, we can see some very large drainage holes. The larger the holes, the better it is, because it permits the water to flow out much more rapidly. There are also 4 little holes. They're anchoring holes. We'll thread our wire through these holes to hold the tree in place. Cover them with screening. I do like to use coarse screening. We will hold our screening in place. They're very large holes, so we're going to hold them in place with some number 2 wire here and here. Again, we're going to make these loops just like the last one. I didn't show you how to do it with the last one. So we have to make it about the width from here to here is the width, the diameter of the hole. Now, turn down the ends, put this through the wire, then the screening. Cut the excess wire off. And there we've got them, the 2 holes that are covered. I'm actually going to use 4 because the tree is slightly unstable. So I prefer to be on the safe side and use 4 anchoring wires. If I don't need them, I can always remove them. I was making some forests over the weekend and literally had sometimes 50 or 60 wires threaded through all the drainage holes. And the ones I didn't need, I would just had someone lift up the pot and I would pull out all the wires that I wasn't using. Okay, we've got our 2 transversal anchoring wires. Now we're putting some lengthwise. So when it's finished, it looks like this. Make sure we have enough on all sides. Now we're going to put a bottom layer of bonsai soil. Now for junipers don't like the same soil as pines. They like a soil that holds a little bit more moisture. They like it more alkaline. Pines require a pH of about 5.5, whereas Chinese junipers should be about 7. So we're actually going to add some dolomitic lime into our soil mixture. So our soil mixture today will be 70% macadamia, 25 to 30% of pumice, and to that I'm going to add an extra 10% of charcoal. Charcoal helps neutralize the soil and keeps it fresh. By fresh, I mean it keeps it from changing from alkaline to acid for the tree. I'm going to begin by putting a little bit of charcoal in the bottom. Now this is coarse charcoal, a thin layer. It's been sifted. I will get some coarser soil mix. So here we go. We've got our coarse soil mix. It's, as I say, a combination of macadamia and pumice. Now I'm adding about 10% of coarse charcoal to my potting medium. Mix it up well. Okay, and we're adding some to the bottom here. Okay, that's enough coarse. The medium, I've already mixed the charcoal in with it. We just put a thin layer, and then I'm going to be putting some dolomitic lime and some mycorrhiza. Before we plant the tree in the pot, I'm adding some ingredients. We're going to start with a little bit of dolomitic lime. As I said, junipers require a pH of about 7. Dolomitic lime contains both calcium and magnesium, and junipers really need magnesium. We'll add some slow release fertilizer. Here we have a little bit of rich earth, which is just some dried fossilized acids that stimulate the root system. And finally, last but not least, the most important, in this scoop here, I have mycorrhiza, and it's actually, junipers take endomycorrhiza, mycorrhiza that grows inside the roots. You can't tell whether it has it unless you look at a root, cut a section of root and look at it under a microscope. But it's very important for the health of your junipers. So here I've added a little bit of endomycorrhiza. It Unlike most other conifers, it requires endomycorrhiza, which grows inside the cells of the roots. Now I will set it in the pot. Before that, there's a few excess roots that I want to remove that have spiraled around the root system. Okay, I think we have enough removed. There's a lot of breathing holes now, and the tree will grow really well after this. Before, the potting angle was that way. Now it's going to be turned about a quarter of a turn. This will be the new front of my tree, and I want it to go a little bit further toward the back of the pot. So I will have to remove some big roots right over here. Okay. Now it should, yeah, now we have more space. We're going to set it sideways like this in the pot. The tree has to be leaning toward the front, but the trunk has to be set toward the back of our pot. Now we're going to anchor it into the pot. It's always a test to find out which wires go with which wires. What I do is I just pull them, try to find out. It's these two here. Again, you have to off-center the tree in the pot. We never want it to be in the center. It looks too balanced when it's in the center. So I'm making sure as I'm doing this that it'll be off-center. Before you tie the wires really tightly, you have to make sure that it's well placed. And when you're tightening your wires, you should always hold the trunk, because as you're tightening, they can pull the trunk out of position. If it's a fast-growing tree and I'm anchoring over thick roots, I'll actually put a little rubber tubes over the wire to protect it. In this case, it's not necessary. Every time you're tightening your wire, you should pull it upwards. And that way you'll make sure that the wire won't turn in the same place every time, because if you're turning it in the same place, it'll just break. You want to remove all the loose in your wire. By pulling it upwards, you're removing everything that's loose underneath. Go. One more left to do here. You want to make sure that the tree is in there nice and tightly. You should be able to lift it up without it moving. Really, it has to be very tight. If it moves, it means it's not tight enough. So we're going to tighten up our wire a bit more. With experience, you'll know when it can't be tightened anymore. Now we add our medium soil mix. Start with your fingers to do the major work. If you don't want to get your fingernails dirty, just put on a pair of latex gloves or something like that so that keep your fingers clean. We work it in between all of those roots. With this tree, I opened up a lot of pie-shaped wedges, so we'll have a lot of soil that's flowing between those roots until the whole pot fills up. Now, why do we use a chopstick? Because, as I said, there are spaces, there's vacuums under the trunk where the soil has been removed from between the roots. And if the roots don't come into contact with a soil particle, they'll dry up and they'll die. So we have to fill all the empty spaces so that the roots will be in contact with our new potting soil. The spaces between the roots are usually underneath the trunk or between the big roots coming from the trunk, so that we should be filling those by leaning our chopstick in and filling them up. Working that soil, using the chopstick, either twirling it around or back and forth movement to get that soil in there, feeling out all the little spaces. When the soil does go into the empty space, take more soil, fill it up, and work in more until you can't get any more into that space. Work around your trunk in a very methodical way. You should, bit by bit, not just here and there. Start in one area and fill all the empty spaces bit by bit. To make sure that the soil is in contact with the roots, we're going to settle it down with this dibble stick around the edges. We can't press too hard, because if we press too hard, we'll break down the akadama. It'll turn to dust. You just want to make sure that there's no spaces. It's pretty high, so we will remove some of the excess soil, because I do want to put a layer of finer soil near the top. You should always leave what's called a collar, a little space between the soil line and the pot, so that when you water, the water tends to stay in the pot. It just doesn't run out. So don't pot your trees too high in their pots. We will put in some fines. I haven't put any charcoal in the mixture of fine, just because it's such a thin layer that you don't need that much charcoal. Or you don't need any, basically. The main body of soil includes charcoal, and also the drainage level and the coarse bonsai soil on the bottom all contain charcoal. And as I said, I put a layer of dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime is lime that contains both calcium and magnesium, because you do need, your junipers do need magnesium to keep their foliage nice and dark green. Okay, so that's it, folks, for today. That's the finished product. You're going to have to put it, as soon as it's repotted, like right now, I immerse it in a pan, a shallow pan of water. The water will come right to the edge of the pot. It can even come higher, and you have to leave it in there for about 15 to 20 minutes for the soil to become completely saturated. Remove all the air bubbles inside. Take it out of the pan and let it drain. Well, that's it for today, folks. Thank you for sitting in, watching my seminar on how to repot junipers. And also, folks, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.